Thank you so much for coming today for our panel discussion on conducting research with vulnerable populations. You may be already familiar with our four panelists. We have Elizabeth Kim from CHS, Meredith Phillips from Public Affairs, Faith Deckard from Sociology, and Randall Kuhn from CHS. I thought it would be helpful to just give you a sense of what instructions I gave these kind people. They agreed to do this, which was I give them a lot of latitude, really broad latitude, to discuss the issues that they thought would be the specific issues that they are most familiar with or that they've wrestled with in their own research that would be potentially interesting to share with the group. So in the 10 to 15 minutes that I've given them to speak, there's no way they're going to be able to broadly cover all of the things that we could talk about in this session. We could do an entire quarter talking about this topic. It's so important and there's so many different issues that come up. So our panelists are going to share some of the things that have been most salient for them in their work in the different areas that they're working in. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Elizabeth Kim is going to kick it off for us.
And from the Department of Community Health Sciences, I see a lot of familiar faces. Thanks for coming today. My work is in the areas of youth incarceration, but not just incarcerated youth, but really encompassing systems that are engaged with youth who are incarcerated. So you can imagine systems of child welfare, low-income families, educational systems, county courts, community-based organizations that serve young people before, during, and after incarceration settings. So I've sort of interfaced a lot of different systems throughout my career. And you can imagine the social vulnerability index is really high among incarcerated youth, right? So you think about poverty, 100% of young people incarcerated in LA County are from low-income families. And that's not because low-income family kids are the only ones who are committing crime. You can imagine why they're the only ones who are incarcerated, right? Also, if you think about mental, emotional, behavioral health problem, 70 to 80% of young people who are incarcerated have some type of mental, emotional, behavioral health disorder. Substance use, homelessness. Think about any social vulnerability that you work on. They are overrepresented in incarceration. So, I sort of did a deeper dive into specific challenges I've had. And one is, as researchers, we think a lot about, as we write proposals, we think a lot about research designs. But working with this population, it's not about the design. It's really even to get started with the actual research that you've designed and got funded for. So just to give you an example, first is the IRB, right? It's literally, I don't know, lack of a better word, it's hell. I have so many colleagues who do work in this area who have completely left working with youth, incarcerated youth, because IRB is so difficult to work with. And these things are in place to protect young people, but it's become a huge, huge barrier. And that's because when I worked with county courts, I wanted to access young people who are incarcerated. And the thing is, we have a lot of data about incarcerated youth, but we don't have their voices represented in our research. And so one of my pilot projects was to go into county juvenile halls and camps in LA County. LA County Office of Education actually invited the researchers to come in and assess teachers who are teaching young people who are incarcerated, but also get perspectives from the youth. So part one, we went through pretty smoothly because we were going to survey and interview adults. And then the second part, trying to get access to the youth, IRB told us that we need to get county court approval. And so when you do county court approval, it's not just like one county court. It's like a million attorneys who are in one like big email thread. You send it out to everybody at any JD that like works in the county court systems to respond within 30 days. What's wrong with my research, right? And so you give that 30 days, and then they came back because IRB said, we are not going to review your protocol unless you have court approval. I waited 30 days. And the court came back and said, we are not going to approve it unless you have IRB approval, right? And so wasted 30 days. I went back to IRB trying to figure out all the languages. I mean, and they were so specific about how are you going to ensure confidentiality, that they're going to participate in research, because they are in locked facilities, right? So if they want to be interviewed, someone has to bring them out. So how are you going to know that you're going to ensure confidentially that this person is actually participating in research or not? If they're in a classroom doing surveys, how do you ensure that their answers are not seen by other kids, or, how is the supervision? Like, all of those things I have to figure out. And in the interim, LA County probation was under fire for sexual abuse. And so, of course, LA County probation said, we are not having any researchers come in and do any interviews or surveys for you. So I actually had to completely redesign my study to recruit community-based organizations who serve young people who are re-entering the community and sort of restart, right? But we could get, but that's not the voice of kids who are currently incarcerated. So some of these IRB hoops, and then, once you get IRB approval, that doesn't guarantee that the facility would actually allow you in. Once you get court approval, it doesn't mean IRB will be happy with it, right? So it's just been like an ongoing sort of challenge to be able to access young people who are incarcerated. And so many of my research colleagues have just abandoned that ship and said, we're going to just work with adults, kids who have aged out of the incarceration and are now in the community, because it's just so much headache. The other thing is, when we go through all these hoops and finally have access to young people who are now going to talk with us, we have an opportunity to get really sensitive information that we might not get otherwise, right? But then there's also issues about trauma and abuse, like mandated reporting about potential abuse that's ongoing. But also, these interviews and these surveys can be very extractive. So, whether it's families who are involved in the legal system, young people themselves who are involved in the legal system, we tried to conduct a study across all of low-income families in LA County. And this was one opportunity for us to at least get closer to sort of epidemiological data on intimate partner violence. And media got hold of the survey and went crazy on us and said, you are taking vulnerable populations and asking very personal questions. And so we had a headline that researchers were being insensitive to this population. And so thinking about how do you balance sort of trying to get and represent their voices and experiences in research and yet not feel like it's extractive, right? The other thing is, and this is very specific, and I don't know if it's because I came from a different university, but, incentives, along with the coercion factor that, how much money is not coercive for kids who are incarcerated, right? And I've heard from some of these kids who say that I'm just really hungry, I just want more food. I want to get additional money to buy some snacks and things like that. But also thinking about the incentive structure that we allow at the university level. So at the previous institute that I was at, they had no concept of physical gift cards and cash as an incentive. And some of these, they don't have access to electronic devices. They don't have, and in low-income families that I was surveying, some of the individuals had shared cell phone in the family. And so incentives would not go to the person that we're interviewing or surveying, right? So we really just wanted to can we get a physical gift card? And the universities kept coming back with, well, you can use this product where you click on it on your phone and then ask for a gift card to be mailed to. I'm like, but that's not a physical gift card. And then there's so much barriers to actually giving cash to participants. And so very, very simple things that we might not think of, that we just assume that everybody has access to a cell phone, a private cell phone, a private email, which is not the case among some of these vulnerable populations. What other things? Make sure I'm not rambling and still. This is great. Yeah, I think those are sort of where I would start. And then, yeah, so another thing is how much incentive. So I went back and forth a lot in our research team when we were proposing to NIH how much incentive is appropriate for young people who are engaging in our research. And, you know, some said 20 was enough, some said not enough because of the amount of time that they're, you know, giving us, the kinds of questions that they're answering. So then we went for 50, but all of these incentive structures also add to our budget too. So if we wanted to have at least 300 to 500 people in a randomized control trial, $50 per participant per survey across multiple waves becomes more than a personnel budget, right? Like, you know, at some point. And so, you know, just trying to balance all of those like practical sort of challenges, thinking about we want to do right by the participants, but also sort of the limitations that we have in our current structure. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Like, of course, when I take a sip of water. Okay. Let me start my timer. So, hi everyone, my name is Faith. I am in my second year here at UCLA as an assistant professor in the sociology department. And to provide a container, so the approach that I took to Megan's question is, well, what insights can qualitative research provide, sort of to this question about doing research with vulnerable populations? And then as a disclaimer and half apology, I will be heavily relying on my script because it's my first year teaching and I'm very scatterbrained. And so please forgive me, but I will try to make eye contact. Okay, so I am probably unconventional in my affiliation with population research centers like CCPR. And the reason I say that is because as a graduate student, yes, I took a demographic course sequence, stats classes, went to PAA, attended the seminars, but less because I was trying to mold my identity into a demographer, and more so because I just valued that approach to seeing and understanding social problems. I wanted to be conversant, understand my peers' work, right? And I just wanted to have that toolkit so that if I did want to answer a question that called for quantitative or demographic methods, I'd be able to do that. But because that was my approach, right? I'm building out a toolkit or learning fluency in different ways of knowing. I also took an ethnographic and interviewing course sequence. I became an RA for both a demography affiliated professor and ethnographic professor. So I could get hands-on research experience in both of those domains. And I'm sharing all of that with you all because, well, I know this is a CCPR event, okay? And I do have some expertise aligned with that. And thinking about conducting research with vulnerable populations, I think it's my qualitative experience thus far that has really provided the most challenges, ethical dilemmas, and insights. So that's why I chose to foreground that today. And I'm hoping that these reflections will translate to some extent. Okay. So with my allotted time, I'm going to focus on two things, if I've measured appropriately. The first is gaining access, and embedded within that, the difference between a conceptual issue and a design issue. And then second, interview informed surveys. Okay. So starting with gaining access, my dissertation project centered on the experience of bailing a loved one out of jail, and it examines the financial, relational, and emotional cost for families. And as just brief context, so we're on the same page, in some US states, families can turn to third-party companies called commercial bail agencies for assistance with bonding someone out of jail. And here, assistance means they provide a 10% discount on that total court-appointed amount. But in return for that discount, they require at least one person from the network to co-sign a bond. And as you can imagine, when you insert a financial arrangement with a coercive undertone into a criminal legal context that has its own coercive and punitive undertone, it's just a pressure cooker for chaos and harm to occur. So now, given that the US disproportionately targets, criminalizes, and arrests low-income Black and Brown men, as a project focused on families, right, that means that women of color counterparts are disproportionately targeted by these companies and then encouraged by their family members to be co-signers. Thus, when I conceptualized this project, I wanted my interview sample to reflect that reality. So I wanted my sample to be comprised mostly of women of color and then particularly Black women, okay? That was the vision going in. So what did I do for access? I moved to Houston for the year. I rented an apartment in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and I hung out around the communal spaces, which, full transparency, there weren't very many of them. There was the laundry room and then the sad courtyard. And then I posted my ad on Craigslist, right, and italicized, compensation provided, right? And I was like, okay, I've covered all the bases, right? These are the things that we do for access. What do you think happened? I got no interviewees from my apartment complex, and literally every group but Black women responded to the Craigslist ad. Literally every group but Black women. And as someone new to fieldwork, new to recruitment, I was devastated. And not just because I was a graduate student, I had told myself that narrative, like I did all the right things, right? That was at play. But also, in a moment of transparency, right? Because I am a Black woman. I was like, what do you mean you don't want to bare your soul to me? Right, but in hindsight, though, I hear how naive that sounds, okay? Because racial homogeneity and even physical proximity, like moving to this apartment complex, those aren't shortcuts for rapport and for building trust. But of course, I read about that, I knew that, but then somehow, when it was time to actually do the thing, I completely sidestepped it. And so after I stopped feeling sorry for myself, I did some research, which entailed I turned to the methodology sections of a few academic works that do what? Center Black women and girls. Okay. And I also went to my network and talked to Black women faculty that I knew that had successfully done this. And what's the consistent thing? Studies that successfully center this demographic spend significant time embedding themselves in the community or building rapport with an organization that then gives them, right, legibility, credibility, so forth. And at that moment, I was like, okay, I didn't do that. And I can no longer be naive. There's no way that I could effectively and authentically do that community building, that rapport building with the allotted time that I had left for my project. And so I pivoted and I re-envisioned the project around support networks more generally, the access that I was being granted. And although it's a very different project than I envisioned, it's still a project that ultimately I am proud of because it's speaking to a different type of variation. And it hasn't prevented me from making it clear that this is a phenomenon that is disproportionately impacting Black women. Okay, that is still very clear. And that brings me to understanding the difference between a conceptual issue and a design issue. So my original vision for the project was not conceptually wrong. It was not a matter that Black women were absent from this commercial build process, right? And I know this because I did ethnographic observations. And who did I see coming in and out of the office? Black women. Who did I speak to on the phone in my position as an agency intern? Black women. And guess who came up again and again in interviews with Black men? Black women. So that's not a conceptual issue. What it was, though, was a design issue, an access issue. And that is something that I took for granted, right? But we learn through our errors. And in future projects, what will I do? Do that community building, that integrating, if that is my hope. And although I'm centering Black women, this applies to whatever population, right, you're interested in. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now moving on to interview informed surveys. So, okay, to be clear, as we all know, given the cost and labor that is associated with designing your own survey, like many of us may not have the opportunity to do that. And that's fine. But I think my plug is that if you ever have the opportunity to do so, especially centered around the condition and experiences of vulnerable populations, I cannot recommend enough the value of first interviewing a sample of your focal population. And my experience, again, is drawing on graduate school, but at the time, there was a more senior student who is now Dr. Shannon Malone Gonzalez at UNC Chapel Hill. But at the time, she was doing her dissertation work on Black women and girls policing experiences across the life course and then across different social contexts, school, work, home. And for her preliminary field work, she interviewed 32 Black women, and for whatever reason, I was in my second or third year of grad school. She invited me along to do this co-authored paper with her using this preliminary data. And we did. And the paper is about how Black women protect themselves during police encounters, as opposed to protecting their spouses or their children, which tends to be the predominant focus. But as we were working on that paper, Shannon received funding from the Horowitz Foundation to develop a survey administered through Qualtrics to a nationally representative sample of US Black women. And because, right, I had said yes to this other opportunity for the qualitative paper, she invited me along to sort of like help generate questions for this Qualtrics survey that would be released. And so we did our research, right? We consulted our faculty mentors, we read up on other surveys, did the validated measures and so forth. But we also turned back to those interviews, because why simply reproduce questions from prior surveys where Black women are often underrepresented, but we could curate questions that more closely align with their lived experience that they just told us about, right? That is also often absent from these traditional surveys. And so this survey now that I'm talking about is called Inner Place. It has its own website, its own DOI, right? If you're interested. But it's rooted in those Black women's lived experiences from the interviews. And so thus, it's featuring questions that I have yet to see before on a survey, right? So it's capturing sexualized dimensions of police contact. It's capturing preparation, the thing that happens before the actual stop. It's capturing policing advocacy, which we don't tend to think about as policing, but in the interviews, Black women were saying, we're experiencing this as the same phenomenon. And then, of course, I was even able to add, like I said, Shannon said, if you help me, like rub my back, I rub yours. So I got to add some validated health scales to this survey, which is amazing because oftentimes surveys focused on policing, lack health questions, those on health, lack policing questions, right? And so now we have this data set that has both. I'm really excited to be able to write papers about that. But anyway, the whole point is there's such a rich synergy, I think, between qualitative and quantitative approaches, especially when we're trying to bridge that gap between vulnerable populations' lived experience and then the tools that we have available to sort of measure and describe those. So here is your quarterly. We will lean into the qualitative research of it. And that's all that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. Now I'm going to cause whiplash because now we're going to lean into the quant. And we're going to also lean into not doing any of the forms of engagement that Meredith and Elizabeth talked about, but hopefully that will illustrate sort of where there are trade-offs and compromises, and where there are things that we can't compromise on. What's important when the goal is to represent the experiences of highly vulnerable populations, understand, make policy, shine a light, make policy. So I'm going to talk about the PATHS survey. I'll try to write. PATHS is the periodic assessment of trajectories of housing, homelessness, and health survey. That's the S in PATHS. My team members, we have to remind ourselves over and over what PATHS stands for. Anyway, PATHS is a representative longitudinal survey of LA County's homeless population. I think the goal of the survey was basically, what if essentially a group of scholars were connected through networks around homelessness in LA and the rise of unsheltered homelessness as a public policy issue. And there was a basic understanding that you can't do that, nothing much works, and you can't do effective interventions if you don't know anything about the population. And so I work with a lot of administrative data from the homeless services sector. I'm part of the team that runs the LA County Homeless Count, and there's just so much, there's more gap than actual knowledge to be provided by these data sources. There's a lot of great ethnographic work, but we wanted to be able to go build on that and say, what if we also had a representative longitudinal survey? Some of my interest in this comes from my basic premise that it is a human right to be recognized, that part of your personhood as a member of a vulnerable, marginalized, or hidden population is that you should be recognized, right? So much, say, of the importance of gay marriage in the US is just the right to be registered, to be part of the system. And so I sort of use that to say that part of the package for human rights is to be included in my surveys. But in a way, that is the intuition here, right? Is that I think about how powerful, say, the Understanding America survey at USC or the Census Household Pulse survey are under any circumstances, but particularly during a context like the COVID-19 pandemic, of just understanding how people are doing. And so what struck me about the PATH survey is over the years, even though we had no intention necessarily of aligning ourselves with the LA Barometer survey, we actually have a data system that looks an awful lot like the LA Barometer survey, which is pretty cool, especially as we start to use the LA Barometer survey more. But it is a very different model, and the basic problem we were trying to solve was how do we do the thing that LA Barometer or Understanding America does, but without an address list, and obviously trying to overcome all the genuine barriers to entry and engagement with vulnerable populations. A lot of trade-offs, a lot of networks just showing up and being in kind of community with people and just seeing the right person and having the right conversation. I think to the extent that we've been successful with paths, there's also just a lot of serendipity, like our project manager and lead scientist, Jessie Chen, just happening to be in our doctoral roundtable course the year that I taught it. And she sort of transformed it, and a couple other really, really important people along the way have added, sort of made it, there is no imagining this without having made those connections. So fundamentally, there's a trade-off, right? And I want to sort of try to frame the trade-off between a mobile survey and a survey that operates, obviously, we could sort of say ethnographically, but even a quantitative survey that involves kind of deep community entry and engagement within trusted networks is the trade-off. At some level, it's a mobile survey is going to be cheaper. And if you're trying to do a survey every month, that it's just going to be that there's going to be benefits to let's just send the survey out and not send like a field worker or do the interview. And also so that's one piece. Another piece is some people don't like to be interviewed. So doing a mobile survey can just be more comfortable. There are a lot of studies that suggest that mobile surveys also people feel more comfortable to answer highly sensitive questions. And so there are a lot of potential trade-offs. There are things you can or can't ask in a mobile survey. Fundamentally, the one big trade-off is do unhoused people have access? Like how much are we able to represent an unhoused population with a mobile survey? And so one other key premise of our work was that, in fact, a mobile survey was exactly the modality you want with an unhoused population because they don't have an address. You can't send them a $2 bill like the California, does everyone know this? The California Health Interview Survey, their gimmick when they invite you to the surveys, they send you a $2 bill. There's no address to send a $2 bill to. We can send you an electronic $2 bill if we knew the way to reach you. Part of the premise for our survey was a couple studies along the way that had suggested that it's not that 90% of unhoused people have a phone at any given time, right? Because people lose phones, they lose phone access, they lose their plan, but 90% have a phone at some point. And right, so there is a small segment of the population, like with any study, that we are not representing because they're simply too impaired or too, for whatever reason, they're not able to ever consistently use a phone, and that we're potentially missing out on including them, and that's a clear limitation for the study. But beyond that, the basic premise is there are some advantages to using a mobile phone approach. One of the big disadvantages is how do you reach people? And so fundamentally, and there are a lot of mobile surveys that just operate on a volunteer basis, or you recruit people through a trusted network. Our goal was to have a representative survey. And so in some ways, we couldn't possibly have done a representative survey of LA's unhoused population if we weren't also part of the team that ran the LA County Homeless Count, right? Because that means we already had teams that were out in the streets talking to about 5,000 unsheltered people every year. And that created a pipeline of, out of those 5,000, we get, say, every year, 1,000 to say they're interested in the survey, and then 700 to do the pre-screen or to do the baseline survey, and of them 500 maybe do the survey. And that sort of whittles down, but you end up with a pretty large sample size. And again, then we can have a conversation about who do we lose along the way in that pipeline of selection. But fundamentally, at least demographically, they look pretty similar to the general population that we're trying to serve. And so that sort of makes it pop. Being able to recruit through the demographic survey made any of this possible. And that is obviously a key for any mobile survey, is you need some point at which you can recruit, preferably recruit in a low-cost manner, if that's the goal. And so it doesn't have to be kind of an ongoing representative survey. But the point is, in a lot of vulnerable populations, there may be opportunities either within a service structure or within a data collection structure where you can sort of piggyback in this way. The big trick, the big, real need was that the LA County Homeless Demographic Survey didn't have any interesting questions on it. And so we were basically able to come in and say, what if we ask all these interesting questions that we don't have time to ask in one encounter in the street afterwards? Okay, so that's that. Then I want to say a little bit about the sort of then the dynamics and the trade-offs of how do you actually effectively do a mobile survey in a highly vulnerable population. Hopefully, our resident intensive longitudinal data and mobile survey expert, Naomi Sugia, has an edited volume in Sage Publishing. It's sort of a series of how-to guides on how to do research, mobile phone research with vulnerable populations. Colleague on a project that Naomi and I worked on, Keith McGinnis and I wrote a little how to do mobile surveys with homeless population. So if anyone wants a link to that, I realize UCLA doesn't have access to that, which is weird, but I have a copy of my paper. I think Naomi has a copy of all the other papers, which are really cool as well. And so we sort of laid out 4 basic principles, and I don't know if they're kind of design principles, I think, but they sort of they touch upon ethical principles as well, and that sort of guide kind of how to do this. And that is thinking about access to technology, thinking about impairment, thinking about the environment, and just kind of how is someone going to answer this survey under a bridge in an encampment with no power or whatever it might be, and then institutional vulnerability, and that being probably the biggest overarching concern. And so I'll try to say a little bit about each of these really quickly. So in terms of access, I think a big choice with a mobile survey is, do you give phones out? Or like I think Naomi did with her study, her famous study in Newark, where she enrolled every kind of parolee in Newark in a mobile phone study. That was sort of at the beginning of smartphones, so maybe not everyone had a phone. Now you find this sort of trade-off that generally what we find is people would rather keep the phone that they have. For us, it was easier to let people keep the phones that they have, and we weren't even installing an app. There's no app for our survey, right? It's just a text message with a web link. But there are those kinds of considerations just to think about. And that is generally that you have to think about what is my survey interface going to look like? How is it going to look like on a big iPhone or a big Samsung? But also, how's it going to look like how's it going to look on an Obama phone, which is what most people in the study have. And so you really have to think about almost, visualize the survey and the Qualtrics interface on a phone. Like anyone who's reviewing this questionnaire on a computer screen also needs to test it out on a phone because it just looks different, it feels different. So that's a big deal. In terms of impairment, I mean, in some ways, it's maybe the interaction of impairment and environment, right? That a lot of us do surveys that are too wordy or too complicated or too cognitively demanding. But obviously, if someone is also facing a lifetime of trauma and maybe does have cognitive impairments or brain injuries and is under a bridge at night, that you do have to think more carefully about impairment. And that is obviously use plain language. I think what we've learned is that, I'll say one big insight we've learned is that a lot of indices that have sort of subtly, like we had a wildfire, a kind of rapid response survey. And again, when you do rapid surveys, you often make mistakes. But like in our wildfire survey, there were, say, 6 items about different effects of the wildfire. And some of the distinctions are a little too subtle to really catch. And this is true. Again, a lot of these are just good design principles for surveys. And again, it's why I always recommend that students take a secondary data analysis course before they do a survey design course, because I think as a consumer of a survey, you learn so much about what not, like, why did I have this question? Why? And so a big thing is we don't have a PHQ 9, we have a PHQ 4. And we have a lot of items where we just have to cut out certain things. And again, you try as much as possible to say, find the validated mobile phone version of this 15 item survey that only has 5 or whatever. But sometimes you don't have that to go on. So you just sort of have to do the best you can. You do as much testing as you can. You try to get as much lived expertise as you can. And then you have to keep in mind that all of these questions are being done, again, on a phone that may not be that bright, in very difficult circumstances, where there may not be that much privacy as well. In general, what we find is that people are fairly willing to answer sensitive questions. Say our substance use questions have only slightly higher prefer not to answer options as others. But again, part of the key here is that we've had to think a lot about how to ask sensitive questions. So one thing that we have, and this is how do you build trust? So we have, for instance, prefer not to answer as a choice on every single question on our survey. And I mean sex, race, age, everything. And Ani Valoria over here has just started using the data on a secondary basis for her dissertation, not being part of the team. And so she can sort of describe the hell that is dealing with the missing. And that is essentially every paper has to have an imputation, a sort of parallel analysis where you impute the data set because the missingness is there, it is real. In the end, we have so many data points that it doesn't matter for sample size. But again, it's something you have to do. And the trade-off for us is we think that it really that the wording that we use, that the availability of the prefer not to answer option, it builds trust that it's better than the alternative of someone exiting the survey. And then that gets to institutional vulnerability. And so the other place that we've made a big trade-off is on personal identifying information, that all we have from the respondent is their mobile phone number, which we need to use to contact them, or if they prefer an email address, nothing else. We don't know their names. And that is because people are really sensitive about sharing personal identifying information. For instance, right now, CCPR funded a sort of acceptability survey of more intensive data like biomarkers, blood, gadgets, PII. And what our respondents say quite unequivocally is they would be far more willing to give blood for research than to give PII. Well, again, just no quibbles. I mean, there are some nuances in there, but it's like 80% to 50% or something. It's a big difference. So for us, not having PII, or not collecting PII is a fundamental advantage. It builds trust. Again, which you need. Again, there's sort of a finesse here, which is people sort of have this willingness to answer questions if there's a level that this is not attached to a social network. This is not attached to a trusted partner. This is just this other thing that I do and that I get a $20 monthly incentive through. And again, that's the other big thing we did was really figure out the gift cards, how to deliver electronic gift cards, how to make sure people are able to use them. And we had to adjust. Initially, we thought that people would just figure it out, but we actually have to have like an undergrad, 10, 20 hours a week, sort of handling any problems that people have when we didn't anticipate that originally. So so you sort of figure out along the ways, these ways to build a level of, it's not trust, but it's acceptance that this is a thing that I do, that this is and people generally say that they like the platform a lot. We have lots of open response questions for say constructs where we don't have a specific question that we want to ask, like how were you affected by the ice raids? We have open response questions that people like to fill out. We invite people to do qualitative study. We have about 3 or 4 qualitative studies where we recruit people through the platform and people tend to like participating in that. So we think that the trust is there, which is amazing. And then just to end, I'll say that the other big trade-off is when you use this modality, you get a lot of data. So we've got 19,000 monthly surveys right now and kind of adding 1,000 every month. So which is a real burden. We've sort of gotten better at kind of doing kind of relevant reports. So there's also just this need to we need to write papers. We also want to report back to the unhoused community, to city council, to county, and doing all that at once takes a lot of work and effort, which is just my way of saying if anyone wants to jump in, a grad, undergrad, whatever, lots of data, lots of opportunities. And I'll say the big trade-off of doing this model is we value not just lived expertise, but like deep engagement with mutual aid networks. But this project did not have that natural flow through to a community of care. And so we've had to, over time, think about ways that we can, instead of building that into the PAS study, it's how can we build other partnerships that are based genuinely in mutual aid communities, and then start to think about how would, say, a mutual aid-based research collective, which we work with, find something different than you might observe with the PAS survey and negotiate it that way. So anyway, thanks a lot for listening. I'll leave it up there.
Great, thank you. Applause for all of you.